Imagine the room is dim and quiet, a little pool of lamplight gathering on a wooden table, the flame steady and unhurried, the air holding the faintest trace of dried herbs and beeswax. You've settled into a warm position, the blanket tucked just so, and the evening has that soft, faraway feeling. Like a path fading into mist, like gentle rain you only half hear. If you listen closely, there might be a distant bell, a sleepy bird, a hush of wind passing the eaves. This is a story for resting, not for judgment or debate, a quiet wander through the past to see how small lives were lived, how people navigated their days with care and ingenuity. Tonight, we drift into a history that is usually whispered rather than written boldly, how women, across centuries and across lands, quietly found ways to prevent pregnancy long before hospitals, clinics, and the confident glow of modern science. We won't hurry. We'll let the old world arrive in soft steps, like linen folding into linen, like a cat settling at the foot of the bed. We will be gentle with what we find. We will keep our voice low. We will notice tiny details, the curve of a clay jar, the press of a thumb into bread dough, the tidy bundle of a midwife's satchel, the dry rustle of seed pods in a corner cupboard. Nothing here is a recipe for the present. Nothing is a rule you must keep. It's all a murmured record of how people once made do with what they had, guided by local knowledge, worn stories, and the rhythm of the seasons. The room grows a little warmer, the pillow heavier, the eyes slower. Let us begin with a village at night, the 15th century perhaps, or another century entirely. Time becomes soft when the fire is low. The lane outside is pitted and familiar, and someone has drawn shutters together. A midwife walks home with a shawl around her shoulders, the cloth smelling faintly of smoke. In her small pouch are herbs tied with thread, a folded scrap of linen, a token from a grateful mother. She knows the women of her town, and they know her. How she listens without rushing, how she understands the private arithmetic of family, what is affordable, what is possible, how many mouths the year's harvest will kindly support. These calculations, done quietly and often, shaped small decisions as practical as they were tender. In such places, knowledge lived in kitchens and gardens as much as in scriptures or ledgers. The midwife's path could pass a garden fence where white umbels sway in summer sunlight, seeds drying on their stalks, plants with names that vary by valley and tongue, plants that villagers called by nicknames, plants that appeared in household charms. You might picture under a trellis bundles of drying leaves, some for teas that soothed cramps, some for easing childbirth, some for after pains, and some whispered about, never claimed as certain, never spoken of openly in the church, herbs that women hoped might tip the body toward waiting rather than welcoming. No one had laboratory certainty. They had trial, error, and the collective memory of grandmothers. A woman might lift a seed to her lips not as an act of defiance, but of timing and prudence, listening to the seasons of her life. Above that same garden, there could be a loft where jars slept on shelves, glass where glass was affordable, glazed earthenware where it wasn't. The labels, if any, were lines of ink that had grown pale and slanted with time. Honey set in one jar, thick and golden, a household medicine cabinet in itself, for cuts, for throats, for conserving the fresh harvest. In another jar, wax sat as pale cakes, ready to seal and soothe. Oils infused with leaves waited for winter. In the low light of early mornings, a woman might stand there and think about her body with the clear practicality that daily life demands. How to space births in an age without official calendars pinned to the kitchen wall. How to keep pace with the year's work. How to keep watch over her own strength. She had the counsel of neighbors, the quick warnings of her mother, the quiet advisory of an aunt who had seen enough seasons to understand that sometimes simply waiting was a resource too, knowing when the body was most likely to quicken and when it likely would not. Some of this guidance was very old, older than the chapel at the hilltop, older than the family name carved above the door. In the bigger world, beyond the village, many centuries earlier, there had been bustling markets in the lands that rose around warm seas. In those places, now only a faint memory by the time our village lamp burns, merchants had once sold a resinous gum with a sharp, memorable scent, and if you stood on a balcony at dusk, you might have smelled it braided with other city smells, animal, warm, spicy, human. Women there had sought plants in ways both practical and ceremonial. Some were mixed with honey or wine, some pressed into little cones to be set aside, some powdered for those who swore by powders. Texts were written, scrolls later copied by careful hands, and in them were suggestions and cautions, many passing into the stream of time where details blur and become stories rather than instructions. The point was never certainty. The point was hope, the kind that a household breathes when it is balancing itself on a thin beam between too little and enough. Back in our quiet room, the fire drops to embers with a sound like crumbling paper. Beds creak a little as people shift. The night finds its level. Women have always had to navigate this terrain between the possibility of life and the constraints of the lives already underway. They were not harsh about it. They were steady, grateful when fortune smiled broadly, determined when it did not. They tried to read their bodies with the tools available. The tally of moon cycles, carved or inked in private notebooks. The observation that certain days felt different. The common-sense practice of saying not now, not tonight, not this week, in households where such requests were possible to make, and honored with tenderness. Elsewhere, in other centuries, there were small devices devised by artisans, sponges cut and rinsed carefully, soft as sea foam, rings made of materials that seemed strange to us now, but were merely what the cupboard held, cloths folded and used as barriers, washed and dried behind shutters where no one would gossip. None of this was a guarantee. It was an accumulation of careful habits. Vinegar stood in stoneware jugs, sharp enough to clear the air, and some believed it could clear away chance itself, though faith in it varied as widely as the recipes did. In cities, later, narrow shops lit by tallow candles sold objects wrapped in brown paper and quiet discretion. Before those, there had been simple preparations kept at home, with instructions passed down as quiet as blessings. The truth is that the past contained both kindness and danger, and women navigated both. People tried things that were soothing and safe, and they also sometimes tried things from fear or misinformation that today we understand were unwise. But the pattern that emerges in a calm, slow look is ordinary love. The love of a woman for the children already sleeping in their pallets, the love of a husband for his wife's well-being, the love of families for a balance that would let them feed everyone in winter without thinning the soup too far. If you can picture a winter evening, a pot steaming gently, onions, roots, herbs, imagine also that the talk around the table was often practical and undramatic. Sewing, mending, the neighbor's cow, the petition at the manor, the path to the mill. In the silence after the dishes were washed, there could be a glance, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet understanding about pacing. Some things were learned without words, the way you learn to bank a fire for the night, so it's still alive in the morning. On a shelf might be kept a lemon, precious in some places, bright as a coin. People found uses for everything fragrant and astringent, working with what they could afford and what they could believe. Sea salt, oils, gentle scents, strong ones, even improbable ones recorded by curious travelers who loved to write down what they were told in markets and bathhouses. These travelers' notes flowed into the general curiosity of later ages, sometimes accurate, often embroidered by retelling. What remains clear when you step back and soften your eyes is the constancy. Women trying to set the tempo of their lives, to space their children so that each could be welcomed with a full heart and a pantry that could bear the weight. By the late hours, when a household breathed together like a single sleeping animal, the day's choices had already been made with delicate fingers. A woman might sit by the window an extra moment, plucking seeds from a head of dill or fennel just to listen to their dry patter into the bowl. A sound as crisp as the page of a book turning. Seeds meant flavor, meant keeping food lively when winter pressed its gray face to the panes. And seeds also meant memory, of old uses, of older stories, of that thin margin between what worked and what was only hoped for. She might trust a certain tea to steady her monthly pattern, or trust that time and awareness were the more dependable path. She might clip a note to the edge of a calendar, if such a thing she kept, or mark the wood of a beam with a tiny sign no one else would notice. And in this same quiet, somewhere else, another woman would do the same across an ocean, across a language, across a century, with her own plants, her own tools, her own blessings and omens. It was not all herbs and jars and calendars, of course. There were also conversations, hushed and kind. A midwife, aunt, or neighbor would sit at the edge of a bed and speak in the slow tone that calms not only the person listening but the speaker too. Words about rest, about healing, about spacing, about when the body is likely to say yes, and when it more often says not yet. Faith and folkways braided themselves around these ideas, not as a proof, but as a comfort. The voices were never raised, the advice never forced. It was offered like a shawl, something to wrap around yourself and keep or return as needed. In monasteries and apothecaries, copies of old texts whispered of past practices, sometimes with the steady logic of observation, sometimes with a touch of the marvelous. Scribes set ink to parchment, archivists tied cords around bundles. The knowledge did not move in straight lines. It moved like water around stones, eddying here, vanishing there, reappearing farther downstream. By the glow of our imagined lamp, you can see how it all rests: the house, the garden, the jars, the small decisions. You can feel under the story a tender purpose that does not need to be dramatic to be important. It is the purpose of keeping life livable, keeping the table balanced, keeping one's own strength. The older you get, the more you understand that steadiness is a form of love. So the midwife ties the last knot on her bundle and stows it in a drawer. The family's cat settles, making that brief, pleased trill cats make when they've found a very satisfactory corner. Outside, the wind threads itself through the hedges, sifted of its bite by the hour. The bed is ready. The night does what nights do best. It holds and hushes, it gathers and forgives. If you are not quite asleep, that's all right. Rest is a generous cousin of sleep, and it arrives by listening to a quiet story about ordinary people doing ordinary things with all the care they can muster. You might imagine the last coal in the grate giving its faint, contented crack. You might imagine, very far away, a small bell over water. And in that pause, you can let your eyes close and remember that, across the centuries, people have always found small ways to care for themselves, to arrange the hours gently, to protect what they love in quiet, practical ways. Let the room become only breath and warmth now. Let the story fold itself like a quilt and set itself down at the foot of the bed. Everything is tending toward sleep, toward the soft woolen field where thought loses its edges, and memory is just a warm light behind your eyelids. You are safe to rest. The sea is quiet tonight in our wandering story, a wide sheet of pewter under a sky the color of worn linen, the harbor breathing in slow sighs as small waves kiss the stones and retreat. Kiss and retreat. A rhythm as steady as resting breath. Picture a port in the old world, centuries before the clocks we know, when time was measured by bells and shadows and the tides themselves. The markets are closing, awnings folded like sleepy wings, and the last of the sailors coil their ropes with practiced hands. From open doorways, warm light spills out and paints the cobbles with honey. Imagine a woman crossing that square, perhaps a spice seller's daughter, perhaps a weaver, perhaps simply someone who knows which alleys hold the cool air and the safest short-cuts home. She moves calmly, taking in the easy clutter of baskets and jars, the low conversation that lingers after trade, the fading brightness of the day's colors. A breeze carries the far off rattle of rigging, the soft clink of glass in a crate, and the faint perfume of distant groves, citrus, pine, crushed leaves that still hold the sun. In a port like this, stories traveled as surely as goods, and in the stories people were careful with their words. They spoke quietly, offering a detail or a caution, an old custom or a grandmother's saying, then letting the tide of conversation lap against it and move on. In such places, the knowledge of family pacing and household timing rode the same ships as pepper and silk. A scroll might arrive carrying thoughts from far off scholars. A traveling midwife might step onto the quay with a bag of familiar tools and a head full of careful counsel. None of it was declared as perfect truth. Everything was presented like a spice to be used sparingly, a scent to be weighed against experience and kindness. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the low murmur of women's voices in a courtyard near the docks. They are rinsing vegetables in a basin, tapping water from a jar, folding cloth for the next day, and speaking in the way good friends do at day's end. Unhurried, gentle, looping back through common worries until those worries are softened by the talking itself. One says she must keep her strength for the weaving due next month. One says the olive harvest will be lean, and extra hands will be needed. One smiles and mentions the moon's slow dance across the week. Their talk is a quilt of practicality, stitched in small squares. Sleep enough, carry less today, cook the soup longer, count the days as you count the steps to the well. Some things are never uttered plainly, and yet everyone understands. In another corner of the city, behind a painted door, the shelves of an apothecary glow with glass. Clear, greenish, warm brown, each bottle a tiny sea of its own. The room smells like a song you can barely recall. Resin and citrus peel, pressed leaves, and a drift of smoke from the lamp. The shopkeeper, a careful soul with ink on his fingers, copies a few lines into his ledger, not of instructions but of arrivals. A shipment of this, a bundle of that, an annotation from a traveler who has heard a custom in a far province and repeats it with all the fog of distance. He knows that people come to him for comfort as much as for goods. He pours, measures, and listens, offering what he can responsibly offer and folding his sentences like napkins. Tidy, modest, never promising the moon. Outside, the bell of a clock tower marks the quarter hour like a calm heartbeat. In the monasteries beyond the city walls, gardeners move through ordered beds, their sandals brushing the paths. They cut stems for the infirmary, mint for stomachs, chamomile for nerves, sturdy roots for winter broths. When night gathers, a brother reads by a small flame, tracing lines in a book that compiles old observations, some clear, some cloudy, all sifted through a patient mind. In the margin, he adds notes in a small hand, not endorsements, not edicts, just reminders to observe kindly, to counsel rest, to trust in time and season. The garden is quiet enough that you can hear the moths tapping at the lantern glass. Somewhere a kettle hums, somewhere a cat threads itself through lavender, and in the city again, at a high window above the market, another woman keeps a small notebook where she marks the passing days with tiny symbols. She has learned, with the dignity of experience, that her body sings a pattern even when life is noisy, and she listens to that pattern the way a sailor reads the wind. If there is music in her home, it is the soft percussion of a pestle in a wooden bowl, the friendly clatter of cups set to dry, the whisper of fabric shaken out before the night air. This, too, is part of the old story. Not secret devices, not daring tricks, but quiet rhythms, rest, observation, patience, braided into evenings that taste of lentils and lemon and warm bread. Farther inland, in villages braided with streams, the seasons pull families along like gentle currents. Spring means sowing, summer means tending, autumn means storing, and winter means storytelling by the hearth. On winter nights, when frost feathers the windows, a grandmother speaks in a voice that is low and certain. She tells of the year when the snows came early, of the year when the wheat stood tall as a man's chest, of the season when it was wise to be careful, and the season when it was possible to be brave. Her listeners stir the stew and feel the comfort of knowing that choices can be paced, that love can be shaped by quiet agreement. The fire crackles, soft, not startling, like parchment gently crumpled and smoothed again. Sometimes, when the talk is tender and the hour grows late, someone will mention a custom from a neighboring valley, something that begins with "I heard," and ends with "perhaps," and in between asks for nothing more than kindness and common sense. Across centuries, this is how much of life's delicate knowledge lived, not shouted, not etched in stone, but carried from hand to hand like a bowl of warm soup, careful not to spill. In the town with the harbor, morning returns like a soft cloth laid over the world. The sails unfurl, the square fills again, the apothecary's door creaks, the garden walls shine with dew. In this new light, the same modest choices continue, the ones that keep bodies safe, families steady, and futures possible. A woman counts out the coins for bread and oil and tucks them into her sash. She picks up the thread of yesterday's work, which is simply another name for today's hope. And when evening returns, she may stand again at her window, pause with quiet gratitude, and let the day's small acts of caretaking fold themselves into sleep. If you listen, you might hear the miniature orchestra of the town at rest, shutters closing with a soft thud, a string on a lute being tuned and then left, a child's laugh trailing off into a yawn, the hush of wind threading the narrow lanes. The moon lifts, unbothered and bright, and the tide keeps its measured breath. In these places, on the sea's edge, in the monastery gardens, on the cobbled streets, the constant lesson is that life can be arranged gently, with attention and care, even when certainty is impossible. That is the style of wisdom that kept homes balanced, a wisdom of timing, of listening, of asking the body to wait or welcome by reading its quiet signs and keeping the days in kind order. It is not a dramatic story. It is an ordinary one, and therefore it is strong. In your own room, wherever you are, you can feel it like a shawl around your shoulders, the slow, steady kindness of people who navigated the intimate tides of their lives with humility and hope. Let that feeling smooth the creases of your thoughts. Let the imagined harbor grow still, the monastery lamp burn low, the market sleep. The air is easy, the pillow warm, and the world, for a few hours, asks nothing more of you than to drift. High in the hills where the paths thread like pale ribbons through thyme and heather, the day folds itself into evening with the quiet patience of a shepherd counting the last of the flock. And our wandering story follows a mountain road that leans between terraces and low stone walls warm from the sun's departing hand. The air is thin and clean, tasting of pine and bread ovens. And somewhere a brook tucks itself under a wooden footbridge with a sound like whispered mending. Imagining this place is easy when you are drowsy. You hear the soft clop of a donkey returning, the padded hush of woven sandals on dust, the mellow clink of a pot hung back on its hook. Here, women carry baskets not only of cabbages and apples, but of the day's small understandings, those foldable truths you keep in the same part of the mind where you keep the house keys and the lullabies. They talk in doorways, voices low and level, as steam sighs from a kettle and a cat wins a sleepy figure 8 against a bench leg. In the last light, a mother counts the shadows of her children on the wall and feels each presence as a weight she gladly lifts. And yet she also knows the arithmetic of flour bins and winter salt, and how many pairs of shoes can be coaxed from the cobbler each spring. In such thoughts, life is measured by careful inches rather than bold strides. The moon rises early, pale as a pearl in milk, and a bell far off answers it with a single, unhurried note. You can imagine a small room under a sloped roof, where rafters hold the faint scent of summers past, and a narrow window catches a slice of sky. On a table, smooth with years, a book with wooden boards rests beside a candle. It is not a book of commandments, but of keeping seeds, keeping stories, keeping time. In quiet places like this, the keeping of time could be a gentle craft. A twig of willow tucked by the hearth to mark a certain day, a thread knotted softly, a little star drawn in a margin. The body's seasons make their own map, and a woman learns its paths the way she learns the shortcuts between garden and well, not as science, but as familiarity, letting the pattern hum in the background like crickets beyond the window. She does not hurry the pattern, and it does not hurry her. It is a shared rhythm, a slow exchange, like handing a loaf to a neighbor and receiving a smile in return. In the cluster of houses down by the river, where reeds comb the current and laundry hangs like pennants of ordinary triumph, the evening stretches wider. The ferryman poles his flat boat across a velvet ribbon of water. The oars make a soft square of sound, dip and lift, as if the river itself were breathing to help you sleep. On the bank, friends sit with their feet in the grass and talk about the week's chores in the same tone they might recite a psalm. Mortar to be mixed, roofs to be thatched, a jar to be mended with resin warmed by the coals. They notice, without making a point of it, that seasons of eagerness and seasons of restraint take turns, as naturally as flood and ebb. Over the ridge, a tiny chapel clings to a shoulder of rock, its stones white as a lamb's ear in moonlight. If you stepped inside, you would find not splendor but carefulness. A broom leaning in the corner, a bench rubbed smooth by hands and hems, a bundle of lavender tied to a nail for sweetness. Sometimes the chapel keeps a small book of prayers for families resting between blessings. Sometimes a kind word folded into the spine as a bookmark. Rest more, breathe more, let the days settle into a gentle sequence. In this valley and others like it, people share knowledge as they share soup, ladled with modest hands, warmed by time, salted by experience. Grandmothers tell of long ago winters when wood was scant, and so was luck, of years when everything sprouted at once, and the barns laughed with grain. The stories are not instructions, only lanterns held aloft for a little while, so that feet find the path without stumbling. In the loft above the barn, where hay sighs and swallows dream on rafters, a girl sketches flowers because she likes their faces, and an aunt hums the tune of a market song and speaks in a hush about kindness to oneself, about knowing when to lift, when to set down, when to let the river carry heavy logs, when to wait for help. This is how the thread of care passes from hand to hand, not a rope to pull against, but a ribbon to guide. Even the fields keep a kind of ledger, measured in mornings when dew pearls on barley, and afternoons when the scythe glides like a calm thought. If you look carefully, you can see the household patterns nested in these larger cycles. Bread kneaded and left to rise while the sun climbs, wool carded as clouds move like sheep across a hill, a child's nap timed by the warmest hour, a mother's rest bracketed by the day's gentlest tasks. Distant bells count the minutes into a soft weave, and the mind, yours now, sinking lower, smoother, follows their pattern with comfortable trust. Somewhere a page turns in a town scribe's room. The quill scratches with the hush of a moth's wing. He copies not edicts but observations from older pages, notes about gardens and harvests, about how households maintain a gracious pace. Nothing prescriptive, everything temperate, like water poured slowly so it doesn't splash. Down river, where traders spread cloth on tables, a woman runs her fingers over linen as if reading with the skin. She chooses a length not only for dressmaking but for promise. A promise that the months ahead can be arranged with a pleasant cadence, that work and rest will keep each other company. In her basket, besides thread and soap, she carries small comforts, a sprig to scent the linen chest, a crumbly sweet for the youngest, a second candle for long winter twilights when reading the margins of the day brings gentle relief. In the farmhouse kitchen, a kettle ticks softly as it cools. Someone draws a mark on the doorframe to fix a memory to a date like a leaf pressed between pages. The mark is simple, private as a hum, and it joins the other marks that make the beam into a quiet family chronicle. Heights of children, firsts and lasts of harvests, the nights when the moon looked close enough to keep. A breeze slips under the door and drifts the candle flame like a sigh. The smell of wood smoke and fresh, cut apples folds into the room, and you can almost hear the light scuff of slippers across swept boards. Nothing urgent lives here. The important things are patient and repetitive, sweeping crumbs, airing quilts, mending socks, choosing when the house is lively and when it is still. These are the tender arts of spacing life so that it can be borne with a full heart. On the hillside path, glowworms make small stars in the grass. A nightjar pulses its soft, continuous note. You might imagine, just for a breath, the quiet figure of a midwife passing like a thought through the orchard, her presence steady as the trunk of an old tree. She brings no dramatic pronouncements, only reminders that the body thrives when it is listened to kindly, that days can be counted in ways that feel like care rather than worry, that waiting is a skill like any other and responds well to practice. Around her, the village keeps its soft habits. Shutters nudged closed, a pot lid lifted to release a puff of fragrant steam, the careful banking of embers with a stub of wood so the morning will wake to warmth. If you are holding any tightness, consider the way these people let the mountain hold them up. Consider the way the river takes each worry and turns it into a ripple that smooths itself into glass. And if you need a sound to follow into sleep, imagine the mild percussion of a rain beginning far away, first on the high rocks, then in the pines, then at last across the thatch like 1,000 friendly fingers. It hushes even the smallest leftover thought. A last window dims, a last cup is rinsed. The story folds into itself like a shawl put carefully away, and you drift along the same dependable current that carried all these ordinary, brave lives, a current made of patient days, of modest choices, of love expressed as gentle timing. Quietly, as the hours fold one into another, and the world narrows to the bluish circle of lamplight and the muffled rhythm of distant footsteps, our story moves into the softer web of town life, where lanes slope between close, set houses, and each doorway keeps its own little world of sounds and smells. Imagine, if you like, a lane scented with warm bread and boiled wool, where a woman pauses beneath a carved lintel to tuck a stray curl behind her ear and listen to the hush. And in that pause, you can feel the small economies of affection that people have always relied on, who will help when a sick child needs water in the night, who will carry a basket to market when one arm is tired, which neighbor keeps a spare candle wound in the pantry. These are the ordinary reliances that make the long night manageable, and in them lie the gentlest of the practices we are tracing, practices that were rarely shouted from rooftops, but instead hummed in the quiet rooms as practical compassion. In this part of town, the workshop doors are closed, and the apprentices have gone home to small fires and folded cloaks. Lace still dries on a line behind a widow's house, and a map of patchwork quilts hangs like a quiet proclamation of seasons kept and mended. The storytelling here is not of clever tricks, but of companionship. A sister who shares a bowl of broth and a lullaby while fingers work at darning. A neighbor who leaves an extra loaf because the winter stores look thin. People learned the shape of their days from such small gestures. How to slow the pace when needed. How to bear the weight of another's need without breaking. In the shelves and chests of these homes, you can imagine modest tools and objects that are more talisman than technology. A folded scrap of linen, carefully laundered and kept away from gossiping eyes. A scrap of writing with a few penciled marks only its owner can read. Dried herbs pinned in. Envelope not because they are a secret cure, but because scent and memory share a kinship, and sometimes scent steadies the heart. There were gentle rituals that softened waiting into something nearer to choice than chance. A walk taken at twilight to steady the mind, a deliberate fast before a feast to remember gratitude, the shared counting of days between friends as an act of mutual care. In neighborhood kitchens and over shared fences there were conversations, low, circuitous, and never prescriptive, where women compared their experiences in the tone of gardeners swapping seed tips. They observed, they listened, they made small personal decisions that fit their circumstances, and private and simple as choosing which wool to dye for a child's sweater. Towns also had places of learning that were quiet rather than grand, rooms above guild, halls where an older woman might teach a younger one to read the margins of a household account, or spaces in which a monk's careful hand recopied a page about seasonal remedies, not to issue edicts, but to preserve memory. People treasured what was steady and repeatable, rest measured work, tempering desires with the demands of daily bread, and they passed such steadiness on as an inheritance more precious than coin. If you picture a late evening in such a house, the sounds are modest and restful. The scrape of a chair being pushed back, the faint clink of a spoon settling in a bowl, the slow creak of a rocking cradle, the soft murmur of two people sharing concerns in voices low enough to be a lullaby. In the corner, by the hearth, sits a small wooden box lined with cloth. Inside are tokens collected over years, seeds, a ribbon, a scrap of beeswax, each one a tiny anchor that carries a memory or an aside of practical counsel. They are not prescriptions, they are reminders, to pace out the year, to nurse one's strength when it is thin, to accept help when it is offered. The town's apothecary, with its jars and folded notes, occupies a modest house not far from the square. The keeper there is as much a listener as a vendor, and people come to him for comfort and for curiosities from distant markets. He might recount, in the trusted hush of his low room, tales brought by sailors of plants from foreign shores, how a bright, leaved shrub smelled of sun, and how a far-off midwife used a lullaby to steady a woman's breathing in labor. And these stories blended into local practice like color into cloth. None of it arrived as certain knowledge. It arrived as counsel wrapped in conversation, and each woman put the counsel through the sieve of her own life and her own sense of what felt safe. In the quieter records, a ledger tucked behind a larger book, a marginal note in a prayer book, a folded piece of linen with a penciled mark, you can read an unassuming doctrine. Treat your body kindly, keep your energy for the tasks you love, space the seasons of your life in ways that allow you to care for others and for yourself. This is not a manual. It is the tone of a life arranged with regard. As night deepens, the town itself seems to take on the rhythm of a breathing creature. A shutter closes like an eyelid. A dog turns and settles with a soft thump. A distant clock counts the hours with slow courtesy. The air carries occasional background music, barely audible, the stringed instrument of a solitary player rolling a soft phrase across the rooftops, the far bell of a chapel between 12 and 1, the whisper of leaves against a courtyard wall. Imagine also the gentler domestic sounds. A kettle's last soft bubble, the whisper of pages being turned as someone reads a familiar passage, the careful folding of a quilt to set at the foot of a bed. In such textures of life, the choices about family pacing were lived more than taught. A conversation held with a sister while washing clothes, a hand offered to steady a young mother, a mutual decision to wait until a harvest returned to steadier footing. Where the law or the learned text could not reach, human compassion filled the small spaces with practical kindness. Neighbors stepping forward to mind a child so a mother could rest, a husband taking on an extra task so his wife could breathe, a community pooling resources in a hard year so that no single household had to carry the full burden. These acts, quiet and ordinary, are the durable scaffolding of any life. As sleep leans in, imagine the town's mosaics of habit and care folding themselves into one soft shape. Children breathing in time with their parents, embers whispering under a lid, lamps guttering down to a steady glow. Let the scene be a kind of lullaby, not of words, but of living carefully, of making small agreements with time and each other that steady the days. There is no drama here, no bold claims, only the hush of people tending themselves and one another with everyday tenderness. Let your attention, now slowing like a tide, rest on the image of a hand smoothing a blanket, of two neighbors sharing a quiet joke about the cat, of a woman slipping a small note into the hem of a pillow just because it makes her feel less alone. Hold these scenes as you would a warm cup, and feel their warmth spread. The town exhales, your body follows. In the hush between market clatter and midnight, when the last lamp is being doused, and the town settles into a patient, breathing thing, there is a quieter history that belongs to thresholds and thresholds keepers, the midwives and wise women who carried knowledge not as doctrine, but as a bundle of experience, who walked between houses with hands that remembered the weight of a newborn and the lightness of a lullaby. Imagine one of them pausing at a doorway where someone has left a small brazen pin and a scrap of ribbon, tokens that mean something like luck, something like a polite turning away from prying eyes, something like a little ceremony to mark intention. In their knapsacks they hold more than tools. They carry stories, confidences, the soft record of what a body has said in the past and how it preferred to be treated. These women are listened to because communities know their worth, because when winter is hard and the granary thin, the value of being able to arrange the family's future with care is practical kindness. Their counsel is given in a voice that sits beside the person asking, the sort of tone that lowers the temperature of worry by degrees. It is full of cautions gleaned from years of watching how bodies recover after birth, of watching which households thrive and which thin themselves out across many hungry seasons. In the quiet of a flickering kitchen, a midwife might sketch, in the margin of her mental ledger, observations about rest and timing, making notes like a gardener might make about the best row for beans. The notes are pragmatic, modest, and never stamped as a law. Around them, beliefs and rituals thread through ordinary life like the seams on a quilt. A small prayer said before bedtime so that the next day's work will be lighter. A blessing passed quietly over the threshold for the household's health. A gentle fast observed in a year when stores will be lean. These practices are social as much as individual. They depend on neighbors who share duties, on kin who can step in when needed, on a husband who learns the value of waiting with patience rather than impatience. In certain places, communal agreements shape private choices. Families agree to space their labors so that apprentices keep their positions, so that a daughter can marry when the household can afford a small dowry, so that each child may be clothed without patching the patchwork until it fails. Such social arrangements are unglamorous but strong, and they are the sort of quiet scaffolding that lets people shape their lives with dignity. Alongside these social patterns run stories told softly in women's company, ballads that fold into advice, proverbs hummed in rounds, and rhymes that remind one to pace one's strength. A lullaby might carry a line that, over centuries, shifts from the literal to the symbolic, so that what begins as practical counsel about timing takes on the tone of moral encouragement. Wait, be steady, tend the hearth. These cultural threads are not rigid rules. They are ways of staying in conversation with the body and with circumstance. In town registers and legal records, one sometimes finds traces of the same careful way of thinking turned into formal terms. References to contracts delayed until a family is ready. Notes about apprenticeships that begin only when fathers can guarantee a wage, community fines that are sometimes remitted because the household's labor is known to be taxed already by illness or crop failure. The legal and the domestic therefore converse in hushed tones. Laws may name what public order expects, but households answer that call with arrangements born of love and necessity. The role of belief church rituals, blessings, votive offerings, intertwines with folk practice, creating a common language of meaning. People bring incense to small shrines, tie little ribbons to hedgerows, leave coins in niches, gestures that are not surgical or precise, but offer a psychological steadiness, a sense that one is doing what can be done. This steadiness, in turn, gives people room to make practical plans without the urgency of panic. In the houses of merchants and in the cottages of fishermen alike, notebooks and talismans keep private records, small carved tokens, tiny cross marks on a hem, a folded poem kept under a mattress. They are intimate things, more about mocking a feeling, this is my season for rest, than about prescribing a method. Even where scholars wrote and scribes copied, the tone is often speculative and humane, pages full of conditional language of perhaps, and it was thought, of lists that read as collections of observations rather than manuals. Travelers' reports, too, have a soft character, an outsider's curiosity recorded with the edges of wonder and the fog of translation, so that when ideas move from one place to another, they arrive seasoned by local culture and interpreted through the filter of caution. The result is a great patchwork. In one village, a certain practice is deemed sensible and harmless. In another, it is dismissed as fanciful. In one monastery, a manuscript dwells on rest and temperance as healthful. In a coastal town, songs speak of timing and heed. Through all these differences runs the same humble principle. Do no harm, tend what you have, and make room for the next morning. Sensory life around these choices is always small and domestic, and therefore soothing to imagine. The smell of dried linen, the faint tang of citrus peel kept for festive bread, the creak of a spindle, the soft clinking of coins counted out for market, the distant bark of a dog whose rhythm is more sleep than alarm. Ambient sounds often accompany the giving of counsel, a clock's slow toll, the drowsy hum of a household beast, warm, the hush of rain on a low roof, sounds that make the counsel feel like a part of ordinary life rather than an emergency. In the long view, the history of these practices is less a tale of secrecy and more a portrait of prudence folded into daily living. Women and their companions learning to read signals from the body and from circumstance, shaping their futures by conversation, by custom, by mutual aid. If you imagine a scene where a group of neighbors share their bread and their calendars beneath a tree, you can see how natural it is to talk about spacing children as part of caring for a whole community. Who will carry extra burdens this year? Who will be given an apron of help? Who will be promised an evening of rest? There is no clamor, no haste, only a steady exchange of favors and an ethic of shared responsibility. As you let your attention drift across these images, notice the gentleness of the decisions. They are made slowly, with an eye toward preserving love and labor in balanced measure. The midwife's voice, the aunt's proverb, the neighbor's nod, all are instruments of a humane practice, and they serve the same purpose, to keep the household whole. That completeness is not measured by numbers, but by the lightness of breath at supper, by the sound of children mid-day laughing, by the fact that a woman can mend in the afternoon and rest in the evening without fear of collapse. And so the night wears on, bringing with it moth, soft silence, and the occasional soft interruption. Bell, a furtive owl, the muffled step of someone returning late. The world you have been imagining is made up of such small, constant mercies, and they are enough. Let the images wash over you. The wrapped skein of yarn on a woman's knee, the folded note tucked into a ledger, the lamp left burning low on a windowsill, the hush of a courtyard under a moon that watches without judgment. These are the frames that hold life steady. In that steadiness you may find your own heart relax. In that relaxation, sleep comes more easily as if invited by an old, patient friend. Rest now, letting the sounds of the town's slow breath and the history's tender manners carry you gently into sleep. Across the span of centuries where towns and fields and harbors braided themselves into the everyday, there also threaded a quieter kind of companionship, the small networks of women and neighbors who shared not secrets for their own sake, but practices of care, the kind that keep a family steady through lean winters and generous summers alike. Picture a long kitchen table one soft evening, lacquered dark by age and use, where several women sit with knitting in hand and words measured like teaspoons, sharing news of harvests and small remembrances of what helped a sister keep her strength. When a child was ill, what soothed a fevered forehead? what eased a mother's weary shoulders. The talk flows without urgency, long loops of memory and reason that return, always, to the same tenderness. How to keep life whole enough so that any new life could be welcomed when the household felt ready. These conversations were never theatrical. They moved like slow drifts of cloud, sometimes lingering on an old proverb, sometimes pausing to let a laugh unspool, sometimes falling into silence so the kettle's last bubble could be heard and acknowledged. There was an economy of care at play. A husband might take an extra turn at the mill. A neighbor might lend a bundle of oak for the winter. A sister might come to sew buttons while another slept. From one hearth to the next, the unspoken rules of pacing life were learned not in lecture, but in example, in watching a woman put an extra blanket on her child, in seeing a household decline a neighbor's offer of work because their hands were already full, in the way people learned to estimate a year's carrying capacity by the look of the barns and the sound of the mill wheel. Over time, these small, careful acts formed a patchwork ethics, a set of practical courtesies and mutual assurances that helped families steward their strength. It is comforting to imagine how that ethic felt to inhabit, like walking a familiar lane with the sun at your back, like setting a loaf to rise while you tidy the garden, like knowing that if you leaned against the fence, a friend would lean back as well. In marketplaces and in kitchens, the language was plain and spared of drama. What mattered were measurements of time and energy, not proclamations. People counted seasons, not headlines. They counted days of rest between tasks, not feats of endurance. The material culture that accompanied these choices was modest and quietly beautiful. Carved wooden boards smoothed by use where a woman marked nights with a notch, cloth pouches with faded embroidery holding small tokens of remembrance, a stitched calendar carried in the pocket and rubbed soft by constant handling, tiny charms placed in a chest, as if to reassure a hand that it had done what it could. Even in places where religious and learned authorities wrote and reasoned at length about many things, the prevailing domestic wisdom tended toward caution and care, with scribes copying maxims about temperance and rest alongside recipes for soups and broths. Travelers who visited foreign markets sometimes recorded strange herbs and curious sayings, and those tales wove themselves into local folk tales in the same gentle way that a melody settles into a different tune when it crosses a border. The result was always adaptation, ideas arriving like seeds and then being tended to local soil, pruned, and either kept or let go according to what the next household judged sensible. That adaptability is part of what kept communities resilient. When a year's harvest failed, neighbors pooled grain. When a family grew suddenly larger, kin offered beds and mending and hands. It's a soft, practical solidarity that does not need proclamations to be real. Instead, it is visible in the careful easing of burdens and the quiet rearrangement of daily life, so that everyone might bear their share. In quieter moments, the bodily knowledge women kept was often coded in poetry and in proverbs, so that it could travel safely and be remembered without recording all its particulars. A line of a rhyme could serve as a mnemonic, an affectionate nudge. Rest with the moon, toil with the sun. Or keep the bread slow and your days slower still. These sayings are small vessels for larger instincts about restraint and timing. They carry the weight of generations in a phrase that can be hummed while mending, as soothing as the rhythm of a spindle. And always alongside the practical language, there was the soft presence of ritual and comfort. A stitch tied in a seam with a whispered wish, a lullaby that folded counsel into melody, a small prayer left at a wayside shrine. These gestures mattered because caring for the body is never only physical. It is also a way of keeping calm the mind and the heart, and calmness itself is a kind of protection. If you let your imagination breathe here, you might picture the simplest domestic sounds as part of this tapestry. The muffled thump of a basket set gently on a floor, the cadence of a hand massaging sore shoulders with warmed oil, the low susurrus of women's voices blending into the background, like the sound of wind in tall grass. Ambient things, the steady drip of rain on tile, the distant toll of a bell, the rustle of linen on a line become companions to small decision, making a private choice feel less lonely. Across the centuries, the balance people sought was neither novel nor spectacular. It was the ancient human aim to make room for love and labor without wearing oneself thin. That aim produced many small techniques of living rather than a singular method, a rhythm of work and rest, of mutual aid, of watching the body and listening for its quiet signals. The long view shows more continuity than rupture. The same sorts of adjustments recur in place after place because they make pragmatic sense within the limits people faced. It is restful to see history like this, as a slow accumulation of humane practices rather than as a sharp catalogue of emergencies. As the night deepens in our imagined scenes, the comfortable rituals continue. Shutters close, a final cup is rinsed and set to drain. A child is tucked with a hand that lingers a moment. A book is laid aside with a ribbon in the page, small acts of closure that signal safety. In the hush, the people we are imagining breathe easily because their days are paced by an ethic of care and an economy of attention. Their choices are shaped by love as much as by necessity. They are pragmatic, yes, but they are also tender. That tenderness is what steadies the household, the careful scheduling of workloads, the willingness to accept help, the mutual conversations that let people gauge when to welcome and when to wait. If any image from all of this settles more easily on your mind than the others, let it be a simple one. A low, round table with a candle in the middle, a quiet circle of neighbors sitting around it with hands busy and voices soft, each person listening and offering small counsel, the candlelight catching the edge of a page where a grandmother's notes are kept. It is a scene of humility and care, modest in every way and therefore grand in its durability. As your breath slows and your eyes grow heavier, let the ordinary rhythms of these people's lives fold themselves into your own rhythm. Imagine the kettle's last bubble sinking with your exhale. Imagine the distant bell mocking the hour as a kind hand smoothing the edge of your wakefulness. The past we have visited is not a map of prescriptions, but a lantern showing how human beings, always inventive and always tender, have long found ways to steward their lives with dignity. Allow that steady torchlight to guide you into sleep now, soft and gradual, like a tide pulling back with a slow and certain hand.